Hello, everybody. Welcome to MEERTALK. My name is Kaisa Fern, and I'm your host for MEERTALK today. We are really glad to be getting together, and we're going to be hearing from Nick Breeze in just a moment. Then we'll take questions from a few people in the MEER community, and after that, we'll open it up to our live audience here. In case you didn't see our recent newsletter, the MEER Poon team just presented at the annual monsoon workshop in India about their innovative water hectare scale project taking place in Africa. In order to carry out all the projects crucial for MEER's further development, we really do rely on your donations. If you don't already donate and you'd like to contribute toward our efforts to cool the planet, we appreciate your donations. You can go to meer.org/donate, and thank you so much for those of you who already do. You can also write to info@meer.org to be in touch. So let me tell you about our guest speaker today. Nick Breeze is a UK climate change and wine journalist and author, and host of the ClimateGenn podcast that interviews experts on climate-related topics. The podcast focuses on how we deal with the consequences of political failure to make structural policies to deal with climate breakdown and approaches to adaptation, resilience, and intervention. If anyone has any questions that come up while Nick is presenting, you can send those over to co-host Kathy Posey in the chat. All right, Nick, well, we're really glad that you could join us today, and we are eager to hear what you have to say about all of this.
Thank you very much. I'm really going to read through my presentation and just break away from it occasionally just to elaborate on some points. I wrote Cop Out because I felt there was a story emerging from the succession of UN climate COPs that I attended, from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai. It's written in the style of gonzo reporting across the 8 COPs, with an enormous range of voices, including people like Professor James Hansen to Christiana Figueres, to various politicians from places like Alberta in Canada or the UK, and a wide range of other sort of actors, if you like. When I talk about the narratives emerging, I think it was something that I didn't realize until later when I started reflecting on the COPs and discussing it with other people. In Paris, there was this real sense that the system, the politicians, the great and the good, had all arrived in Paris to save us. They came up with this agreement. They all lined up. There's amazing photo shoots, and everyone left with this great sense of optimism. And then of course, the next year, President Trump enters the White House, and it was literally a few days before the COP. So when we arrived, it was literally like someone had just ripped all of the oxygen out of the place. It was a complete sort of atmosphere of despair. Then the next year I wasn't really planning on going, and then someone talked me into it, and we took some students from the UK, and it ended up being a massive eye-opener, because what we saw here was this sort of youth, international youth, were starting to manifest, starting to really develop their own energy. And it was something that I hadn't seen in the last 2 COPs. In Katowice in Poland, that was when you first saw sort of Greta Thunberg arrive and start to sort of bring this movement of the young together. In Madrid, the young were the story. The politics had sort of shrunk. It was all failing. And this new energy was very much with the young. In Glasgow, which was the next mega COP after Paris, because they're every 5 years, in Glasgow, the COP again was this sort of cataclysmic failure. And yet the people outside, there wasn't this sort of joyous youth movement. It was actually a movement of anger. People were genuinely shouting as you went in and chanting, and there were drum beats. I mean, it was quite an intense atmosphere. And then you go to Sharm el-Sheikh, and basically activism was kind of wiped away. When you went into the COP, there was a designated area, and you would see protesters given a time slot to do their bit, and then they were sort of shuffled on. And very same last year in Dubai. So it's kind of these themes are emerging, and we've also seeing these in these recent COPs and very much COP29 in Baku. These are places which are basically fossil fuel authoritarian places where very different dynamics to what you might expect from a progressive climate conference. So the failure of the process in achieving reduced emissions is not really the fault of the UNFCCC, because really it's the national governments who never honor their commitments after signing up to them. And we'll be hearing a lot about nationally determined contributions in the coming weeks as every nation is starting to submit their renewed plans to reduce emissions under the Paris Agreement. And given that emissions have continued to rise since Paris, it's really hard to trust developed nations who label themselves climate leaders while continuing to profit and subsidize with public money the fossil fuel companies responsible for the problems. And for the last few years, because this is you see the emissions curve going up, and you're essentially going to a conference which keeps telling you it's going to be doing the opposite. So justifying why do I keep going to COPs? I've had to think about it quite a lot. And the one figure who really helped me a lot to see through the lens of the vulnerable nations was the late Professor Salim Ul-Haq. Interviews with Salim are quoted throughout COP Out. And when we spoke in Paris, he was upbeat about the progress, but realistic about the challenges. They fought to get 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. The other nations didn't really want it mentioned. In Bonn, he called out the fossil corporations as murderers for the attributable death they were inflicting on people across the world. When we spoke after COP26 in Glasgow, he said that vulnerable nations left Glasgow with tears in their eyes. But it was in Egypt where Salim really made the best case for why COPs are important. He said, these are the only meetings where vulnerable nations have a seat at the table. They're not always listened to, but at least they get a chance to make their case. And there's no other place where they can do this. And for me, this really resonated. And it's kind of, well, if we start pulling away and the COPs lose any sense of platform for vulnerable nations, then I think it does them a further injustice. So by speaking up and by showing up and speaking with delegates from the global South countries, we get a strong sense of the urgency of the crisis, especially before, when they were already experiencing it much worse than the global North. Also, we can now very clearly see in the global North that we're not exempt from catastrophic impacts. Many of the concerns of the people in the global North, like immigration, for example, are tied to problems being faced by vulnerable communities in the global South. Not helping them respond to the crisis that we created weakens our own credibility, but also, I think, our own ability to respond. These large-scale systemic problems require all nations finding ways to collaborate. And I began to see this more and more over successive years. So for me, I feel it is important to show up. Another reason is that at the subnational level, where politics tend to be more agile, we see policies implemented at great speed. This can be at the city or regional levels within nations. There are many forums where knowledge is exchanged and collaborations take place, all accelerating much needed change. A good example is the C40 mayors, the global network of cities that are sharing responses to climate impacts. Finally, with emissions still rising and eminent scientists now saying we are heading to a +3 degrees Celsius average heating, the topic of climate interventions is moving from the fringe closer to the main stage. And I've recorded many interviews on this topic with people from across many fields who are both for and against research and development. For years, the debate on geoengineering stagnated. The old arguments, such as the moral hazard or inflicting unknown outcomes on already vulnerable nations, had caused a deadlock. That's changed. At the last COP, I would say that the change was the most dramatic that I've witnessed. I recorded interviews and attended sessions where quite a few global South voices from Asia, Central America, West Africa, all the way up to the Arctic Circle were demanding that research into climate engineering be financed. Their argument was simple. Society is not changing, and they stand to lose everything. If there is even a slim chance that something like solar geoengineering can work, it must be investigated. And from the interviews I have given with many scientists, many of those who are against deployment are for research. Sean Fitzgerald from the Centre for Climate Repair put it well in an interview recently when he said that if a nation or other actor decided they were going to deploy geoengineering, it would be good if scientists could say, if you're going to pull a lever, don't pull that one. So it's this idea that we try and figure out what we know doesn't work or what we know could be really dangerous and try and guide rogue actors or nations who might be just feeling they're in the last chance saloon. When it comes to many of these interventions, for me, I feel very, very difficult around saying that I'm for geoengineering. But I think the new voices who are able to articulate research, reasons for research and strong reasons for caution need to hold sway. Climate interventions really need to be integrated into the mainstream of the climate negotiations, because otherwise, as one young guy said last year, it becomes another instance of the global north deciding what is best for the global south. On deployment, I was discussing this a couple of years ago at COP26 and COP27. Sir David King, who was a British chief scientific advisor, and Professor Dan Badansky, who's a professor of law specializing in geoengineering from the US. They both seem to think that deploying a large-scale solar geoengineering effort would likely be orchestrated via the UN Security Council. And if we look around the world today, we can see huge amounts of money, well, comparatively to the past, flowing into researching geoengineering. Ideas for cooling the Earth, or parts of it like the Arctic, are being tangibly developed. None of these may work, but the fossil fuel industry is still in charge. The safe operating space for humanity, as Professor Rockstrom says, is fast moving beyond its threshold of viability. If we can extend that threshold for any amount of time while we rid ourselves of these malignant industries and politicians who front them, then we will have achieved something great. I think the COPs should be that forum for exploring all these ideas with all the parties at the table. Let's not go to the Security Council set up to deal with disputes and conflict. The fossil fuel industry has of late hijacked the COP process. This year we go to one of the birthplaces of the oil industry, Baku, whose stated aim is to triple its methane gas exports, which is ridiculous in the context of what they're meant to be hosting. COP29 is being dubbed the finance COP, where negotiators are trying to work out how much money will be given to vulnerable nations for adaptation. The figure of $1 trillion per year is being talked about with some enthusiasm, with hope that it's not pie in the sky. The level of trust between global South and global North nations is currently very low. There have been too many broken promises in the past. This figure of $1 trillion, about 1% of global GDP, is a necessary step in the COP process, and we need governments to honor their promises. It is foreseen that a big chunk will come from public finance and a big chunk from private finance and businesses. This is all the agenda setting for the mega event next year in Brazil, COP30, the next big stepping stone following Paris and Glasgow. All of this leads us to the elephant in the room, which is the US election. On the several NGO webinars I've attended recently on COP themes and planning, someone always asks in the Q&A what will happen if Trump wins. Of course, no one really knows. Instead of trying to hazard a guess, I would like to just read a few excerpts from the chapter in COP Out from when I arrived at COP22 Marrakesh, a few days after Trump was declared the winner of the 2016 election. And if it was to repeat, I imagine it would be something similar this year. The United States had elected Donald Trump to be their next president the preceding day. The previous COP21 had ended with an overall feeling that something had been achieved, but that it was tenuous and required nations to both honor their commitments and increase their ambition. Trump had declared while campaigning that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement as soon as he took office. COP22 was already underway when the election result was called, and I could not imagine what the atmosphere was going to be like. Images of the descending gavel and the jubilant politicians leaping into the air in Paris were slowed down in my mind, melting like old film against a burning projector bulb. How things had changed. Christiana Figueres had stepped down and been replaced by Patricia Espinosa, Mexico's former Secretary of Foreign Affairs. I knew little about Espinosa, but was curious to see how the incoming Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC would address this very obvious politico-climatic disaster. Inside the media center, I took a moment to scan through social media, looking for reactions within the COP. A statement from the Secretary General Espinosa sprung to the top, reading diplomatically, "I would like to congratulate Mr. Donald Trump on his election as President of the United States, and we look forward to engaging with his administration to take the climate action agenda forward for the benefit of the peoples of the globe." None of this boded well for COP22, officially tasked with the real purpose of beginning the implementation process of the Paris commitments. On top of that, the wealthier, high-emitting nations were meant to be agreeing on the package that would concretize the long before agreed $100 billion a year. This was to be paid to the poorer, vulnerable nations who are already dealing with climate impacts, despite not having caused them. It was hard to see how any of this could progress. The next quote that appeared was by the German climate scientist Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, then director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, who stated, "President-elect Donald Trump's stance on global warming is well known. Science cannot expect any positive climate action from him. The world has now to move forward without the US on the road towards climate risk mitigation and clean technology innovation." Schellnhuber's comment was devoid of spin and cut through the diplomatic niceties that were filling the official channels. Whatever the criticism might have been regarding the outcome of the Paris COP, the early signals in Marrakesh were looking brutal. I rose early and headed into the COP. Inside, the mood seemed to be increasingly bleak. Most of the younger civil society delegates I saw looked grief-stricken, others angry or just sullen. Walking along the concourse on the way back from recording an interview, I saw a fast-moving scrummage of people with Espinosa in the middle, tight-lipped and moving at speed, possibly to avoid press entrapment. There was none of the usual swagger of officialdom. Instead, they passed as fleeting apparitions. COP22 was over before it began, and it bleached away the outgoing optimism of the Figueres era of global diplomacy. Throughout these negotiations, it often ends up being the United States that scuppers hope. It also builds them too, but ultimately the American colossus of consumerism and carbon pollution, hindered by a blindness to its own appetites, sets the currently low probability of survival for our own and many other species. The mood was low and political failure was in the moment. Actual failure in the broader arc of our collective actions was yet to be determined. Events had moved so fast that the US negotiators were still here, rendered impotent by events. The outgoing Obama administration, like the rest of us, appeared in a state of shock. Secretary of State John Kerry represented at the COP the upper echelons of the administration. He had spoken in great optimistic tones in Paris as the momentum had grown towards a globally inclusive and diplomatic outcome. Kerry stood before us in an overheated temporary press conference room, so packed with journalists that the building wobbled portentously throughout the speech. He was here to deliver a very different set of crafted words to those upbeat ones he gave in Paris, his demeanor darker, the timbre of his voice holding an edge between hope and despair. Okay, I'll finish there.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's so pertinent. We have a few days to go in this country until our election. So what we'd like to do now is bring on a couple of people. We'll start with Kyle Kimball to ask some questions. Kyle Kimball is a graduate of the VU Amsterdam International Migration and Refugee Law Legal Master's Program, who until recently practiced in the EU. In March, Kyle made his way back to the US, where he now serves in the Washington State Office of Minority and Women's Business Enterprises, helping shape state law and democratize agency contract spending in benefit of marginalized populations. Kyle actively participates in climate research and lobbying efforts with a number of MEER adjacent groups, and in his spare time, you can find him baking bread and lifting weights. Thanks for coming, Kyle. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nick. Fascinating always to hear what life is like on the other side of the veil, sort of conversations that are happening in these spaces that so few of us will ever get the chance to be within. I have two questions, if that's all right. And the first is, so the Global South's continued existence in terms of habitability can be measured on a much shorter time than that of the Global North. What incentive is there for the Global South to wait on UN-led or Global North-led geoengineering efforts when it has been repeatedly communicated that their survival is not a priority?
Oh, yeah, it's a very good question. Well, I think the impacts are their motivation. I mean, Salim Hug gave me you know, I think they've built that adaptation in places like Bangladesh where they've got these amazing warning systems that when typhoons and things strike, they can get many people to safety, and they've reduced life loss considerably. And it was a great sense of pride that they were able to teach us things. When there was floods in Germany a couple of years ago, they were asking Salim and people like that for advice of how do you deal with these kinds of things in the future. So I think this comes back to what I was trying to emphasize, is that our fate is connected, but we need to, their incentive to wait for these technologies, um, it comes down to survival. I mean, I did a Q&A with 50 students in the Philippines a couple of weeks ago, and there were people there from all walks of study and industries and things, but they were really sort of aware of their own vulnerability, and they were aware they had just so much direct experience of it, but they were extremely optimistic. There wasn't any sense that they were going to perish. They were going to survive. It was just how hard they were going to have to fight. So I think they're naturally much more robust in terms of this idea of optimism. And what I noticed at the last COP, which I was just talking about, and I've got some interviews with people there. They're so articulate on making their arguments as to why this should happen and why they should be part of it, and why is all the supercomputers in the global north, why have they not got access to these things, why are they not represented in the IPCC, all of these things. They understand it, they're raising it, and I think it's creating its own momentum. I think that is starting to happen in terms of collaborations between academic institutions and things like that.
Awesome. And then I guess as a related follow-up, so in building the use case for the COP, have you seen sort of an evolution of COP's utility, less as maybe a platform for the Global South to speak truth to power, and more as a platform for collective organization outside of these institutions, which have systematically diminished and demeaned the entirety of the Global South?
Yeah, well, I think the platform for making these cases, Mia Motley has been quite a tremendous speaker at the last few COPs in terms of really laying it on the line in very articulately in terms of what the problems are. And the COP itself is become quite a strange place because you have this sort of like a trade like a trade fair on one side, and then you've got this politics which is all shielded and crawling with fossil fuel lobbyists and all this kind of stuff. But then you have these sort of big delegations, these pavilions, and there is I mean I think it's creating its own energy. You see a lot of the subnational stuff, which I referenced to when I was speaking, of people self-organizing, and I think that's where the real resilience and strength is coming from: self-organization, from knowledge sharing. People basically saying, we're not waiting for this. This is ridiculous. Let's go and form our own groups and let's push these things that we want to talk about. And I think that's much more dynamic, and it has given the COP a better meaning, a new meaning, I think.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Kyle. And just a reminder to everybody in our live audience, you can send any questions to Kathy Posey in the chat. We'll get to those in a few minutes. So next we'd like to bring on Noah Diaz. I believe it's Noah. Yeah, good. Noah is a third-year civil engineering student at the University of California, Merced, with a passion for sustainability and clean energy. Dedicated to addressing climate change, Noah is focused on developing innovative engineering solutions that contribute to a cleaner, more sustainable future. Thanks for being with us, Noah.
Thank you. I just had one question. Um, from what I've heard and everything, you've seen firsthand the power of young movements and grassroots movements. And I was wondering, um, to you, what role do you think those, like the smaller movements, have on more of an overall policy, and how um, those movements can be tied into helping more of a bigger cause?
I think there's a word I've been using it a lot, which is articulating, being able to articulate nuances and concepts and things that we need. And a lot of the time, there are these big gaps because people don't know how to articulate what's going on around them, or their fears, or their concerns, or the things they know should be happening but aren't happening. And I think these smaller groups are very good at articulating nuanced things, and then communicating them. And I think they really do count, because I think they all are the parts that add up to a greater whole. So I would definitely attribute value to all efforts, from the small grassroots to the larger organizations. I think one thing that came out of the COPs was, and this was really noticeable in Madrid, you have these big NGOs with their massive pavilions, and I mean, it must cost an absolute fortune. And then you just had these youngsters coming in, and the press were all over them. And it really sort of then fed back to the larger NGOs that they had to somehow raise their game. And then suddenly they were getting much more involved in direct action. And, there was this sort of push and pull between where the agency was, if you see what I mean. So I think, yeah, I think you don't know what's going to stick. So we have to try everything.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Noah. And we'll bring on Vian Nguyen. Vian is a first-year computer science student at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey. She is active in the Undergraduate Student Alliance of Computer Scientists and the Rutgers Students for Environmental Awareness Club, which is what ultimately drew her to MEER. Thanks for being with us, Vian.
Of course, and thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed listening to it.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that in many ways COP has been ineffective, and yet you decide to keep going because you think it provides a platform for some countries to talk about the issues that they are facing. So do you think that COP has helped meet any specific goals?
Yeah, I think well, specific goals. I think we have to come back to the the main thing of reducing global emissions. Because if we don't do that, then we're kind of, we've lost the overall the Rockstrom thing of the operating space for humanity. And I think from that point of view, that's where the failure really is. And in terms of successes, I think it's quite hard. It's quite hard to come up with things that it's really achieved. So no, is probably my short answer. I'm sure there are some if I was to mull it over, but I think that it's become the central place for the climate movement, and I think that's really important. And I think we've got to try and win back the agenda and actually start getting those goals achieved. I think that's the fight now. I'm someone who runs around with a camera, so I'm not, my job is just to record voices to try and do that. And I think how do we get those voices more heard? How do we create momentum? How do we push back against the power of the incumbents who are forcing us not to achieve the goals of what we need? So yeah, I'm a bit negative on the actual achievements of the COP.
Okay, thank you. And I just had one more question. So, how do you think that we, as like, I'm a college student, and how do you think that some people, like college students or younger generations, can help ensure that their nations follow through on their COP agreements?
Ooh, keep speaking out, keep doing all everything you can when there's an opportunity to have a conversation or any kind of public participation. Just get involved and be part of the voice. It's been an amazing impact that the generation coming up has been able to reinsert some momentum in. Older people have, I think, taken energy from it, but certainly felt more invigorated by younger voices as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Fionn. So next we are going to, well, I'll be asking a few questions from our live audience. And again, you can send any questions along to Kathy in the chat. We have a question from Cam. Cam asks, have you detected any new allies in the latest COP?
Allies. I don't know about allies. I mean, I think I have the big thing I've really noticed is younger groups being able to form very international alliances among themselves. I do feel like I'm more of a sort of fly on the wall in most of these cases, but it's kind of I see them self-organizing, and it was actually I think it was Sheldon Huber about 6 years ago when we spoke in London, and we were talking about in the context of Brexit, of Britain leaving the EU, how does Britain remain relevant when it's outside the big bloc? And he was talking about self-organization. He was, and I was sort of thinking, oh yeah, hope that comes to something. But at the COPs, I've really seen it with my own eyes, and it's people you may not agree with what they're saying, but that's part of the challenge. When the people you want to empower suddenly turn around and say something you weren't expecting, well, that's what this is all about. It's the discussions we need to have, whether you agree with it or not.
Right. Here's a question from Bob. Is there an official mechanism for nature's agency in the COP proceedings?
Well, the Ecocide campaign has recently made some gains, and Jojo Meta, I think she's the chair of the Ecocide campaign, she's going to be at COP29. We spoke recently, so I'm going to interview her on their progress, I hope. But Ecocide seems to be one that could be, if it was taken seriously and adopted by the international courts, then I think that would be nature's defense. I think that was always Polly Higgins's dream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a comment and question from Mark. Mark, I really liked your comment on the need, at the very least, for COPs to persist, as this is the only place where smaller and largely forgotten nations can be heard. Have any of your conversations with people on solar radiation management given you the feeling that the climate powers that be, that have been so against SRM, have that view because they feel that to seriously study and consider them would signal to the world the real bleakness of our situation and would be seen as an unacceptable embarrassment to the efforts of the IPCC and to world powers in general?
Well, yeah, that's quite a big question. And I think over the last decade of 2010 to 2020, the fossil fuel companies with things like ClimateGate and I mean, the UK was very aggressive. I think in the US as well, the stamping out of any real mention of climate change in mainstream media was so aggressive that there was no discussion of anything. So in 2013, 2014, I was doing a lot of interviews around solar radiation management, even with people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was sort of saying, I'm up for learning more. I'd like to know what I'm saying no to. If I'm going to say no, I'd like to know what it is I'm saying no to. And there was a lot of willingness to engage, but it was only among thought leaders. It wasn't in places where governments could finance it, because governments just simply were not interested in talking about climate change. Even the British representation at COP21, it was kind of empty. David Cameron was waxing lyrical on stage and going back and doing all the opposite things in policy decisions. So being able to then articulate a geoengineering position from that, I think it's only now when we're really starting to listen to scientists and we're seeing the hurricanes, typhoons all the way around the world, events that are completely unimaginable but really quite logical when you see the oceans heating up. People are like, I think we're going to have to do something. We can't bend the emissions curve down because no one's doing anything there. So we need the British government just made I think it was 50 million pounds available for grants for research into geoengineering. So people are submitting their plans. So there's an uptake, but I think the last decade was lost and there was no discussion really at all, except around people already sort of in the space, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, here's a question from Kathy, because you spoke about the different delegations that have shown up. If you could give advice to the COP delegation of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, a country of low-lying atolls, what would you tell them? How at COP should they engage to make their voices heard?
I think the problem with the COP is that it's like a bubble. Once you're inside, you think that everybody is there and everybody's watching and everything you do is going to resonate all the way around the world. And what you really realize is that it is this big bubble and not much gets out. I think there has to be a sustained communication and strategy that goes throughout the year and maybe culminates in events at places like the COP. I think it has to be ongoing, continual, documenting plights, what's happening, forecasts, what does the science say is going to be the trajectory under the scenarios that we're currently in. I think, we're on a business as usual sort of trajectory at the moment. I think it's important that we keep talking about the outcomes of being on this trajectory and not get lost in the optimism of pledges and things like that, which haven't materialized.
Right.
I think so. Sticking with telling that story all year round, I think, is the best strategy.
Mm-hmm. Steady.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Peter. After 3 successive COPs, which are not productive, how has this affected the momentum, either of COP itself or maybe of the movement? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the momentum is, it seems to have moved away from the talks. There's a lot of cynicism when we see that last year Al Jaber, the president, he was sort of upset when he got criticized by the press and held press conferences trying to tell everyone all the great stuff that had been going on. And yet, really, no, no, there is nothing happening. Even the thing I reported on for a magazine, which was the Emirates Declaration on Land Use and Agriculture, which 144 countries signed up to. I spoke to someone in London a couple of weeks ago from the Natural Environment Research Council and said, "Oh, Britain signed up to this. Can you tell me what's happened?" And they just said absolutely nothing. And so, these big announcements, this is coming out of this COP, they generally just leave, and all of these things. So the cynicism is kind of an accurate emotion, unfortunately. So I'd say that the momentum's been decimated. I really think having the COPs in authoritarian locations, I mean, this idea of protesting in little pens that are sort of, go over there and you can, between 3:30 and 4 o'clock is your slot. It's not what it's meant to be. I think the momentum from civil society of having that kind of raw, open voice is really important. And I wonder in Brazil what it's going to be like, whether it'll return to some of that former momentum shifted where civil society starts to get more involved. But I think that's a big problem because we feel like we're disconnected from a process that's been swallowed by oil executives and so on.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question from Herb. What would it take to get climate intervention on the formal COP agenda for possible endorsement? How likely is that to happen at, say, COP 30?
I don't know what the process would be, but when the British government is actively giving away millions of pounds, not giving away, but allocating it for research, then a conversation around, well, can you put this into your delegation's sort of list of agenda points that should be brought up with the UNFCCC? So I think the UK is probably not the only nation with these kinds of thoughts and strategies for dealing with it. I'm sure the US is, or Canada, or somewhere will be also thinking along these lines. So I think those conversations then happening, and then a sort of process of pressure coming up through the nation delegations. I think something has to happen along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we have a couple other questions, and there is one person who wanted to know whether, these smaller countries are showing up seeming more desperate in the way that they're, participating.
And it was hard to say from just speaking to several people, but in one interview I gave after the last COP with a guy from Central America, he was explaining that it's not just the impact of one event that happens and you clear up and carry on. It's when you get struck by these events, it impacts the development, the economic and the social development of that country for long, long, long periods afterwards. So the desperation is already embedded in the situation. It's almost though, a typhoon from years ago is still being felt today. It's this kind of idea that how on earth are we going to get out of this situation? So I think there's always that desperation in terms of, you know, we are already on this sort of desperate downward spiral. I think that's coming out. But again, I'm only speaking to several people, so I can't speak for broader.
Yeah, of course. Okay, we have a question from, I think it's G, and it's about this extreme competition for, the monetary system. And so G asks, how can the extreme competition that the monetary system exerts on today's essential and determining production and distribution structure, as well as the respective financial holdings in banks, which force absolute sales, and not to forget the respective military or defense apparati, how can, to secure all the raw materials and the resources and transit routes, how can all of this competition, which has meanwhile become deadly for all life on the planet, be resolved or dissolved in the short term as one of the main driving forces into total self-extermination, not only because of the danger of world war, but also because of their immense emissions and raw material and resource consumption. So how can, yeah,
That's quite a
kind of
complex.
a long question, but
I think one way of looking at it in a way is that, if you look at the struggle in the US election at the moment, I mean, no one would say that Kamala Harris represents a sort of utopian climate solution, but the opposite is an aligning with other authoritarian regimes, which all have massive fossil fuel interests, a very sort of bleak future outlook. If you go down the sort of the Trump, the Putin, all of these routes of continued fossil fuel use, ignoring institutions like the UN and so on. So I think the deconstruction, I think in the short term, we don't know, because this is the fight we're all in, really. I mean, deconstructing the system that is destroying us is a colossal thing to even think about, let alone to do. But I think it's yeah. I mean, the answer is in the question, is that it's such a difficult thing to contemplate. But we have to win, and that means that we have to find ways of electing the right leaders, to making sure that their policies are about transition. We don't need so many armies. We need more ecologists. You could think differently about the world we live in, and I think I'm not totally pessimistic about that, to be honest.
right. As a journalist, this is a question from Barbara. As a journalist, what advice would you give to climate organizations about communicating the urgency of the situation to the general public? For instance, I'm just thinking here at MEER, we often talk about our messaging and how to get the message out.
Events, talking to people, I think it's so powerful. As someone who tends to sit at computers and edit or write stuff, I do find that when you actually speak to someone and you're face to face, the impact is colossal. So I think always not shying away from directly speaking with people is important.
Right. Well, here is one other question from Kyle, who wondered, what emotional and psychological effects have you personally experienced bearing witness to and documenting the intentional sale of our species' survival to fossil fuel lobbyists, if any?
I think it's yeah. I do mention this a little bit in the book as well, because when I first started getting into it, I was coming from more of an arts background and a wine background, and I was completely different. But I started doing interviews and looking into this, and it was overwhelming in terms of emotionally digesting it. And there's a sense that you have to change everything right now, and there's panic. And that also, if you are in this state, it's not the best way to go out and talk to people, because people start to think, oh my God, this person's ill. Yeah, we've got to. but you kind of you go through that, and I went through it, and then I came out and became much more able to process a lot of this stuff. And obviously there are some things you read and you get those glimpses of how tough things are. Or I think it was last year or the year before when all of the penguins died in Antarctica. It's things like that which were just sort of, you could see why these things are happening, and you can trace the root causes all the way back. And I think those things really can catch you off guard, and they're becoming more frequent these days. Um, but having support groups or having people you can talk to, I think is really important. Not suppressing things. I've had people contact me who I've realized are going through some of this stuff, and one guy told me he was quitting his job and all this kind of stuff, and he was going out to convince everybody that they needed to do stuff, and it was quite an amazing conversation with someone who's going through, having gone through it, and trying to reassure them. And so yeah, I think I have found it very tough, but also now I take it as it comes, just sort of, yeah.
With the recent extreme weather events in Florida and Spain, what are the chances for the general public to recognize the urgency of climate change, especially given the challenges posed by widespread misinformation, conspiracy theories like cloud seeding, and considering 80 million people are about to vote for a presidential candidate with the slogan, drill, baby, drill?
Yeah, I don't know, because the research has shown that people who are impacted by a lot of these things actually still don't believe that climate change is real. And so obviously people's critical thinking or sources of information is not always as good as it could be. And I know people who think I'm completely bonkers, and that it's all an imaginary part of sort of an Earth cycle or something like that. And it's very, very difficult. I don't know. I mean, I think ultimately you have to, with on a broader scale, detach from trying to explain climate science and actually just talk about, well, we know they're going to happen again because the sea's really hot. So maybe we need to increase our infrastructure resilience, and maybe just not just leave the climate conversation and focus on, if it happens again, you need to make sure your house is strong, or whatever the scenario. But yeah, it's so tricky in the disinformation age.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned, earlier some of your work in journalism, and of course you have this wonderful podcast. And I just wondered myself if there are, ways in which some of the material on that have, stretched your views on certain things, or kind of changed your perspective on something, or anything like that through your work on that podcast.
Yeah, massively. I mean, quite often it's only when I listen back and it's listening to what people are saying, and it's crystal sort of clear. It's sort of obvious. Of course, it happens like that. Or, I think this summer I was doing it down in southern Portugal in Alentejo, working with the wine commission down there, and a lot of it is climate adaptation, because they're getting more and more days over 45 degrees, which is in Fahrenheit, so well over 100. But the work they're doing, I mean, it's desertification. If these estates collapse, then the communities die, the area turns to desert, the species have gone extinct or disappeared. But the work they've done is absolutely amazing. And I think Jason Box, the glaciologist, came down for the second week of the road trip. And before he came, he was saying, aren't these guys just fighting gravity? I mean, he was looking at the climate data and he was just like, it's going to get worse and worse. But after a few days, even he was like, wow, these guys are taking on sustainability and winning. They had instrumentation everywhere. So they've got all this hydric stress of the plants, trees, the piping water all over the place. And you see this sort of engineering, recycling municipal water and then using it for irrigation. Then these water pools were bringing species back. So huge corridors of rewilding. And it was the 5 days at 45 degrees Celsius, and they were not troubled by it. And they kind of normalized these extremes. So the conversation we were having is, well, what's the new threshold of viability? What happens if you get 2 or 3 weeks at 45 degrees? At what point does it become too much? But it's a different conversation to you can't survive in that heat. And so I was really inspired by what can be done. And it takes investment. It takes a lot of ecologists. It takes engineers. It takes this sort of brain pool. So that's work we're publishing soon, but it was really, really changed my view.
That's so inspiring. And that's a great note to leave us on. So thank you very much, Nick, for coming to talk to us about this. And we appreciate all that you've had to share and wish you, all the best with all your different work.
Thank you very much for having me.
At MEER, we are working to help educate the public while also developing a solution to the warming on the planet. We invite you to keep learning about Earth's energy imbalance and climate science on our website. We're primarily a volunteer staff, so please do consider making a monthly donation of any amount if you have enjoyed being here, if you've learned something here. And you can check out our MEER Talks, our previous MEER Talks, including subjects that have come up today, on our YouTube channel. Also, you can check us out on social media, and if you've found being here today beneficial, please do tell somebody about it and pass the word about MEERTALK. We hope to see you again next month, so until then, wishing everybody well, take good care. Thanks for coming.